I've discussed the office and hybrid remote debate a few times. This time, we're going to get some research based tips and insights around it. So keep listening to learn about this and anything related to HR. You can also find me on YouTube. So today, I am so happy to have a couple of guests. They are Dr. Peter Cappelli and Ranya Nehmeh. Amongst so many things, Peter is the director of Wharton's Center for Human Resources. And also, amongst so many things, Ranya is a workplace strategist and adjunct professor at the University of Applied Sciences in Vienna. And together, they've authored a book called In Praise of the Office: The Limits to Hybrid and Remote Work. Hello, Peter and Ranya.
Hi.
Hello. So glad to have the two of you, and welcome back, Peter. Um, but we're going to, as always, dive right into the topic, and I'm so interested in what you have to say. It's already been debated a fair bit on LinkedIn in my LinkedIn circle, with people mostly criticizing, I'll be honest. So I'm really interested in what you have to say. So in your book, you're making a bold case for bringing people back to the office full time. I think that's what you're making the case for. So one quick question before we dive into the topic. Uh, when you say bring them back to work, are you distinguishing at all between hybrid and remote work?
Thanks very much, Andrea. Yes, actually, we are distinguishing between the two because remote work somehow is a little more straightforward in the sense that the expectations are kind of clearer. There are systems that are often built around it. Companies that are fully remote, they never had to unlearn any practices of, for example, in hybrid working arrangements. So it is very different than when you have a hybrid setup, which is often seen as the best of both worlds, but also referred to sometimes as the messy middle because it comes with a lot of challenges as well. So, yes, we do make that distinction.
A little addition, I think, and that is that I don't think we're arguing that people should come back to the office per se. Everybody should come back, get rid of hybrid. We're just making the case that there are lots of good reasons for time together, and that is what the office has provided. So a lot of the book is about, okay, if you can't bring everybody back or you don't want to, then what do you do? How do you deal with the problems that we are now seeing? So I think that's the part of the discussion that has been ignored. It's mainly been a kind of data sort of story about who's doing it, how many people are doing it, how many days, that stuff, without thinking about what's actually happening in the offices where people are remote and hybrid.
Yeah. Okay. So that just rolls into the obvious question of uh, what are you seeing? What are we seeing? We talk about the numbers of how many people are, you know, hybrid, how many people are remote, how many people are in the office. But we're not talking about the quality of that experience. So, your research, what did it show?
So let me just make 2 points and then turn to Ranya. The first one, which is pretty obvious, is people are just not coming in. So they have anchor days and people aren't doing it. So, the evidence in the US is, 40% of people say they don't come in. And more than that say they just coffee badge. Coffee badge means you're supposed to be in today. So I come in, I swipe my badge, I get a cup of coffee, I go home. So they literally make an appearance, but they don't come in. So that's the first problem, is pretty basic. You can't have advantages of hybrid if you're not actually hybrid, if people don't come in. And the second one, which is also pretty obvious, is we're spending way more time on meetings when we're remote than we did in the office. And by every measure, the meetings are worse. So those are two things that are pretty obvious, easy to measure. They're real problems. We don't seem to be doing much about them.
And perhaps if I can just add on to that, what we're also seeing is then, hybrid setups, they sometimes really lead to like deep inequities when it comes to visibility and career progression. because sometimes employees who, for example, need to work remotely or choose to work remotely, they become more invisible to the decision makers. So although their contributions are just as important, maybe they're less likely to be on the top of the manager's mind when it comes to promotions. So this is really, it becomes more about kind of less about performance and more about the proximity bias.
Yeah, I was afraid of that from the very beginning, that one around proximity and promotions and stuff like that. Um, Now, from the flip side, what does the evidence say about business outcomes?
Well, I think that is pretty clear and not so well known. So the early evidence on this were from two studies done before the pandemic, individual contributors, and they showed that in one case, so for patent attorneys in the US, pretty narrow groups, they were completely on their own. And when they were allowed to go remote, things improved. Their performance went up. The other, which was for travel agents, showed that uh, in China, when you allowed them to choose where to work, the performance went up. The evidence since then, unfortunately, is all in the opposite direction, with the exception of one study that found no performance difference, but an improvement in retention. But the others, not just on productivity for individual contributors, that's part of the problem, right? Is that you can easily measure individual contributor contributions, but most people are not individual contributors in the office. So the other studies on help seeking, on innovation, and on measures of individual productivity have shown actually worse results. But I think our concern is not so much driven by those studies because they're all pretty narrow, right? They're usually looking at one measure of performance, not others. We're more concerned with kind of what you can see going on in offices, the lack of interaction between people, the lack of communication, the slowdown in feedback, the wasted time in meetings. I mean, it's just not managed very well, is really the point.
And perhaps maybe just to add to that, also what we saw is that, for example, newcomers or people in their early careers, they really struggle in these kind of environments because they need to learn from somebody, they need to watch, they need to observe, they need to ask for help, and it's really difficult to do that in a remote setting. So this is one thing as well that we see. So this creates, I think, a lot of issues as well.
I've heard interviewed some people who are obviously advocates for remote work say, well, you just have to eat, not just, but you have to be intentional around these things. But we'll talk about that. I want to deal with a few obvious objections and things that I've heard in other discussions on the topic. The first is that there's such a phenomenal savings in terms of real estate and the cost of having an office that there's obvious advantages that outweigh, some of the difficulties. What do you think about that?
Well, it is true that uh, with permanent remote, especially, you just get rid of your offices altogether. You do have to ask yourself, though, we usually argue that employers are just penny pinchers, right? And they ignore the human dimension. So if it was such an enormous savings, why wouldn't they do it? Why are the employers pushing for return to the office if it was so incredibly efficient to do it otherwise? I think the problem that we're seeing is that, at the very beginning of the pandemic, huge number of companies, 70% said they were going to do it in the first quarter after the pandemic, cut their office space. And once you cut your office space, you can't bring people all back to the office, whether you wanted to or not. So the problem now is, okay, if you want to have hybrid, and we're not arguing against hybrid. If you want to have hybrid, great, and you've shrunk your office footprint, okay. Now an anchor day is not going to do it for you because you can't get everybody back in on your anchor days because you don't have space for them. So what are you going to do differently? Well, you have to be pretty purposeful about it, right? And that's what we just don't see happening. I just saw a survey I learned about today that only 25% of managers reported that their companies had any kind of practices around managing people hybrid and remote. And they just, just kind of assuming, and that's kind of the theme of our book, is that they just sent people home and assumed you could just manage them as if they were in the office. It just doesn't work. Right?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And what we are saying is that actually we do have to be intentional about certain things. So Andrea, what you mentioned about being intentional, yes, that is part of also making hybrid a success, is to be intentional about your practices, because otherwise you can't assume that it will just come together.
That's in terms of hybrid work. Well, it's and remote work. Did you just say though that you're not arguing against hybrid? You're only it's mostly remote that you're
Well, I think our point is you can see how much you benefit from interactions with other people. And when you don't have them, things just don't happen. So then that should happen. So then the question, what can you do about that? If you're permanently remote, and we looked at some of the companies that are permanently remote, sort of the GitHub people, and they seem to think they make it work. Fine. Let's assume they do. They've got rule after rule after rule after rule after rule about how you have to interact with each other. And I just don't believe companies are going to do that. In fact, if you look at those permanently remote companies, virtually all of them started, as Ranya was saying earlier, they began as remote companies. And so you grew up with it. They didn't have to change anything. But if you think you want to be permanently remote and think about the real estate savings, as your CFO was saying, get out one of those rule books from one of these companies and see if you think you really are going to get all your executives, for example, to document everything on Google Drive, to specify after you've done something what you've done, to have complete transparency so everybody can just look at these public documents and see exactly what you did, exactly what you're doing next, exactly what you did today. It's just not gonna happen, right? So, we're thinking mainly about how to improve hybrid. There's not that many companies that have gone permanently remote, so started up that way, but big companies, they really are not permanently remote. They're mainly hybrid, so that's where the action is, right? But hybrid is everything, as Ronnie was saying, right? It's everything between everybody never coming in and everybody always coming in, so, of course, it's most companies.
okay. So that well, we talked about the real estate. The other one I've heard is well, with remote, you can get the best talent with remote work. You can get talent from anywhere. It's like top talent. Why wouldn't you want that?
Well, I mean, just a couple of points. We've seen this in places where you hire managers remotely who to be someplace else, and we see it, frankly, in other countries. And once you do that, you can never get those people really working together, right? You're not going to fly people in from India for your monthly meetings, or at least companies are not doing it. And, you run into people who have never met their direct supervisor, right? So, okay, if you're going to do that, if you're hiring individual contributors who never need to interact with each other, that's fine. Or you're going to hire them from someplace else and you're going to spend a lot of money flying them back and forth all the time and get them to agree to do that. Okay, that's fine as well. But what you can't do is what companies are doing, and that's they're not paying attention, or they were not paying attention to co-location when they're making these hiring decisions. And then they're trying to get people, they're wondering why people don't know each other and they don't interact well, and I don't know my boss. And, I mean, that's just a bad idea, right?
And perhaps just to add to that as well is that, this idea maybe that remote gives you really the best talent is perhaps slightly flawed simply because the talent without, as Peter is saying, without any kind of integration, without mentorship, without this culture, it's not that conducive for long-term success. So yes, if you're an individual contributor, you could probably do it alone wherever you are. But otherwise, if you're part of this team, if you're part of this whole learning within the organization, then it'll be very difficult.
The final one I want to address quickly is that it's better at home because employees can focus. They don't have so many distractions like they would in the office. And don't you want them to be focused and be, you know, creating products and delivering, well, I don't know about delivering results, but getting stuff done.
How's your dog doing, by the way?
So, what is she doing? What is she doing?
I mean, mostly mostly the people.
She's chewing on Kleenex. That's what she's doing.
Yeah, there you go.
And it is distracting.
Yeah, right. The people who are most inclined to be home, we understand, are people who are trying to balance family issues at home. And, the idea that you're not distracted at home is simply not true. I mean, it's partly why we've seen the rise of this second shift, and when they measure internet use of employees 7 o'clock at night post dinner, that's when it spikes up because then you've got some undistracted time. But the other problem with that argument is that we are spending so much time on these virtual meetings. You don't have a lot of time that's free from distractions, right? So, but it is true that that is the idea behind hybrid, that if you have work which is individual contributor based, we should be able to find some way for you to get it done. And the problem that companies have got now is they have so shrunk their office space that they made it worse. People don't have space in the office to be to get their own private work done. It's not just shrinking the office space, it's been the move to open office plans as well, which allow you to shrink it even further. And then if you're that as an employer, you're making the case to send people home because they don't have any quiet space and they don't have any distraction-free space, but that was something the employers created. You could be less distracted in your office than you are at home if you wanted to do it. And one other point on that, a lot of distractions are actually good for the organization. That means I got this wicked problem and I need to see Andrea right now. I stick my nose in her office and I say, Andrea, what is the code for this thing here? You're distracted, but my problem is solved. So my solutions are your distractions, and that's not necessarily a bad thing for the organization.
And also, maybe there's also a kind of a hidden cost because when you are at home, doing focused work, let's say, then it also you have the work-life balance sometimes also gets shifted, right? Because as Peter is saying, then you end up working later. You blur the boundaries between your private and your work life. So there's so many other factors that are there as well. So yes, in some cases, for individual contributors, you might be able to concentrate perhaps a little bit more, but then there's also other costs that come with that as well.
So I think, just the point I think we both want to make is that we do understand the benefits of flexibility. Both of us work from home, mainly.
No,
From,
me too.
I mean, mainly at home, uh, and Ranya completely at home right now. We understand the benefits of this, and we do think it's important that employers find ways to give employees more flexibility. We understand that. What we're objecting to is this idea that you just send people at home and then expect it's all going to work, which is not happening. And most all the problems we're talking about could be managed better by employers. They just haven't really tried. I mean, this is really a management problem, right?
So, what are the problems that managers should be managing better?
Okay. Let me reel off a couple quickly and then Ronnie can follow because I talk faster. So, oh, one is enforce anchor days. If you let everybody pick their own anchor day, it defeats the purpose, which is often what's happened. Put some constraints on meetings. They've gotten bigger, they've gotten longer, cameras off means nobody's paying attention. So have a policy. Fewer meetings, shorter meetings, got to have your cameras on or don't bother coming. Those are pretty simple. The others maybe require a little more effort. And I can chime in a minute, but I'll let Ronnie jump in on some of those.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think other things that we could add here is how is something actionable is revamping how you measure performance. Instead of focusing on everybody's key performance indicators, which are just very individual, then you have to make them maybe more team, maybe more team incentivized or something. So this is something, and also how this will affect promotion so that we move away from this proximity bias as well. So we're not
Yeah.
promoting the wrong people for the job. Just, instead of promoting people then that we see what they do when you're working at home, sometimes the managers don't really see that. So you end up perhaps, promoting the wrong people. Tied to this is also career planning and advancements. How do managers make decisions about career advancements when you're not in the office and when they can't observe you easily. So this also is tied to the previous comment. And here we suggest also practices like having 360-degree feedbacks, peer feedbacks, and these kind of practices.
So just to jump in on that, it got worse with the pandemic because when the pandemic started, supervisors were told, rightly, we got to focus on what you want each person to do and hold them accountable for that. So the push toward individual KPIs was not always there, but it accelerated with the rise of COVID, right? And we haven't backed up from that. So we still have this very individual performance KPI thing. Part of the reason that matters is Andreas pinged me for something, but I got this KPI stuff I got to do for you first. So, and what I heard from people is, I'll get back to her tomorrow. I'll finish all my stuff first and then I'll turn to her. Well, it could be a crisis for you, but it's not a crisis for me. So it's the bottom of my list, right? So we're talking about reorienting performance. It is really about reminding people that these things really do matter. And right now, I think they're not thinking that.
Under what conditions are you seeing that flexible workplaces are performing better than in person?
Well, I think the complication is we only really know what people are claiming about their own practices, right? But when we see ones where they say they work well, one of the things we see, maybe paradoxically, is they get people back together frequently. They'll have every month or so a meeting where we've all got to be there. And in that day or two when we're together, that's when we have our most important meetings. Nobody is zooming in for those. You got to be there. And they take these things quite seriously. So they take the building of the social ties and rebuilding the communication. They take that seriously.
Mhm. Anything to add, Ranya?
I mean, I think as we said in the individual, when you're an individual contributor, that probably works well. If you have a certain task, a certain project, you know exactly what to do, and you're working on it alone, and it's very clear what your outcome is, then this is where you probably you can do it well.
I think at least in the US context, one caveat to people who like that idea, I'm an individual contributor, just let me be remote permanently, is that it won't take long before some CFO says, well, Peter doesn't have to be here. He doesn't have an office. We don't see him. They're going to ask, why is he an employee at all? Well, you're effectively a contractor. We don't see him. You're not managing him. He works by himself. Why not just make him a contractor? And I suspect that's worse for most people. So I wouldn't necessarily be jumping up on the bandwagon to say, let me just disappear and go move to Aspen and I'll work remotely from there, right? One of the things we've known from longer research, particularly for expats, if you're away from the headquarters, people forget about you. And if they make a cut, you're the first people cut because easy to do.
No emotional connections to people who are going to advocate for you. A little bit. So, a little bit already, we've talked about promotions. I could see this one coming where anybody who doesn't have FaceTime isn't going to get promoted. And so, what advice do you have for HR professionals trying to manage succession planning and things like that?
Yeah, I think there's something else though. It's not just that if you're not there, you're not going to get promoted. And in hybrid environments, people can kind of choose. And you've heard this from CEOs say, people who want to get promoted show up. um, in that people are kind of choosing based on their life circumstances where they think they can come in or not. And that's the unfairness part. But the other part, going back to the KPI thing, is that if that's all you're assessing for people, we know not a great predictor of promotion success. There's pretty good evidence if you take individual contributors, at least in some jobs, and you promote them to manage individual contributors, they're worse at it because their whole orientation is how do I get ahead? And you want to put me in a job that says, how do I help you ahead? I'm not any good at that. And I would say that is a bigger concern than the proximity bias thing. Proximity bias thing is a self-selection issue that some people are more able to get in than others, and that is a concern. But I'd say this KPI thing is even bigger.
And maybe what HR leaders need to do is to really adjust their performance metrics and to kind of train managers to evaluate outcomes, so that it's not about presence, it's about the actual outcomes, right? So this is one thing. I mean, this is a big cultural shift, but
But measuring outcomes separate from measuring KPIs?
Personal outcome. So, did you help the team? What did your workers say about you? When people ask you for help, are you responding to them on time? Those things. See, I think this is what struck me as so interesting about this question, the whole question of this stuff, is that we could see how office work now got done in the office with social context. And so much of what we're describing just got done informally, right? We didn't have to reward Andrea for answering my question because I'm right in front of her. Right? I I work near her. I got a question, so she answers my question. And if I'm a reasonable person, I understand not to just keep pestering you or you signal to me, I'm really busy now. It got managed through interpersonal relationships. And so we ignored it. We just assumed this is something that just happened. And maybe when people are around each other a lot, it does just happen. But once they're not, it doesn't just happen. And that's what the book is really about. Okay, it's not just going to happen now. This is what we've lost if you're not face to face. Could you put it back together? You could. It's going to require effort and, some time, particularly from managers. If you're going to do it, that's fine. Make it work. Great for employees. Great. Go do it. The problem is going to be back on the managers now, right?
All right. So, okay, talk to me about the problem on the managers. Like, how are managers coping in hybrid and remote workplaces?
Well, I tell you, my sense is they're not getting any guidance from the people above them. And when they don't get guidance, who wants to be the bad cop? So I saw this in a company we were following, and every supervisor is allowed to set their own team days. Do you want to have a uniform day where everybody has to be there? That would be the right thing. But everybody comes to me with their problem as to why Tuesdays are a bad day for them and why they'd like to come in on Wednesday. Do I want to be the bad cop? And I look around and nobody else is being the bad cop. And I look to see what does the bosses say, and they're not saying anything, right? So without direction from the top and the people at the top saying it's Tuesdays and Thursdays, we're all going to be here Tuesday and Thursdays. You have to be here as well. They leave it to the line managers to set the rules and enforce the rules. Boy, that's really hard, you know. Rania, who has been a professional manager, is shaking her head saying, I wouldn't want to do that.
it's tough.
If I'm an HR professional supporting, maybe I'm new to an organization and I'm supporting a workplace that has that's either remote or hybrid, more likely probably hybrid. What are the red flags I should be looking for to say that the arrangement isn't working?
Okay, so I think that in hybrid, the problem is probably inconsistency. So as we said, you have some people in the office, some people not in the office. There is also things like inconsistent in-office expectations. So nobody really understands when they should be there or how to go about it. Also, things like quiet quitting or disengagement is a red flag because you have people who are there but not really engaged. You have perhaps even talent attrition in early careers and early career roles. As we said, it's usually the newcomers or maybe the younger employees who still can't really navigate the hybrid. They have nobody to ask for help. They don't get guidance. So maybe you might see a higher talent attrition in that group of employees. If you see the promotions, if they're skewed towards more in-office employees, then this is also something to think about. Or managers were kind of avoiding performance conversations or struggling with kind of accountability. So uh, I would say these are all red flags. So it's really about inequity and kind of coordination. With remote settings, it's probably different because there are red flags, but probably more about the connection, cohesion, long-term belonging because everybody's more remote. So it's different. They're both serious, but the red flags are different.
In the book, we outlined a series of things that you could do to test this. I mean, one of them is to talk to your IT people, see how much time people are spending in meetings, how big are the meetings, how long are the meetings. You could try a simple test, ping people and ask them for help and see, what proportion of people get back to you and how long it takes. And don't lie about it. Say, look, we're checking to see, about communication. I just wanted to ask you a couple of things. Ping them and see if they respond. See how long it takes to get responses back. So we've outlined a bunch of things you could do to test. I think the problem that HR has in general, which is way beyond this, they often have leaders who have preconceived notions which may not align with the folks. And the problem HR has got is they have to show them stuff which reflects the reality, and it may not be what the folks at the top want to see, right? And that is not necessarily a career building move for people, you know?
Yes.
So that is a tricky thing, right? And
A tricky thing.
maybe the third part of that is that I think increasingly in bigger companies, the very top people have decided that it's more useful, certainly more fun, to spend time on strategy and with investors and with deal making rather than running the inside of the organization, right? So they just don't want to spend the time showing up for meetings with employees, walking the halls, the kinds of things that are required if you really want to change the culture of the place or change practice, reinforce them. It does require a lot of their time. They don't have a lot of time. And I think it's not their preferred use of time, right? So that's the problem HR folks are up against. And it is, it's a big one, right?
So, I think you mentioned in the book that companies now have two distinct cultures, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. I this just tweaked my interest, and I'm interested in what you learned about this and what we should be doing to fix it.
I can just tell you my own experience in my own university. It's very clear, right? People who were there before the pandemic know each other. They know how the system works. They come into the office, they're kind of looking for each other. The people who are hired since, which is now a lot of people, right? Because it's been 5 years, right?
Yeah.
And the average job tenure in the US is 4 years. So, you know, get a lot of new people since then. They don't know each other. When they come in, they just go to their office and they go home. There's hardly any interaction among the new hires, and it's mainly among the older folks. The older folks know how to get things done. The younger folks don't. So the younger folks are constantly needing to check with administrators and things to get things done, but they don't know how to do it because they don't know the administrators. So they just end up with these long problems which they can't get solved. And people who've been there longer know the person. They just go knock on their door, see when they're there, or call them up and say, "Hey, Ranya, why is this problem? Can't we do something about this?" And then poof, it gets done. So it's culture, but it's also differences in practices that you're seeing between these two groups, and they don't understand each other as a result either. So why don't you just solve this problem? Well, I don't know how to do it. Well, just ask somebody. I don't know who they are. You get those differences.
And I think that HR leaders in general, what they need to do is intentionally design new rituals. They need to define new ways of connecting, realign kind of like leadership behaviors to this new normal. So it's all about also creating this one culture, it is not caught. I mean, it has to be kind of taught in a way. So all of these practices have to align with that.
That ritual idea is one that's been percolating a little bit for me and has been popping up in random places. Um, when you say rituals, what kind of rituals are you talking about?
Did you
Perhaps just go ahead, Peter.
or did you see the Starbucks story about this? That they have these coffee tasting rituals among the employees, where they all get together and taste different coffees. And, I mean, maybe it matters for the work and stuff, but it's part of something that they all get together, they enjoy. Yeah, it's part of the story. When you don't have regular schedules and people are not there together, and Starbucks today announced they're making everybody come back 4 days.
Yeah.
But if they're not there and they're there on different ways and, in the corporate offices anyway, you just don't do that anymore. Right? So there are, could you create something like the coffee tasting rituals, where people have a reason to be there? It brings people together. Um, Not talking about social events per se, because one of the problems we know with regular social events is you just talk to the people you already know. But there are things that you could do that force you to talk to other people. So you could have assigned seating, you know? It says, we want you to sit your department, this other department, your department, the other department, right? So, and tell you to talk to each other about something about work, right? So I think we can create interactions too. But you can start to see as we're describing these things, it's a lot of stuff you have to do.
I think a lot of companies also are kind of creating moments that matter to bring their employees together. It could be anything from like a project kickoff to, I don't know, coffee sessions. As Peter said, it could be a host of things, but you have to try to create that with intention to make people interact. Otherwise, you do end up going and hanging out with the people that you already know, and you kind of lose the interaction and this collaboration.
It almost sounds like this is a whole new, in a sense, a whole new specialty of HR, but it really reinforces that idea of being intentional, and being intentional about the touch points and how people are going to interact and when they're going to interact is so important. Big companies like Amazon and I don't know, a lot of them are making headlines for forcing employees back to work. When a company is going to force people back to work, do you have any suggestions on how to make that happen? Did you guys cover that?
Sure. The first thing they should do is open up a book on organizational change, right?
Hmm.
One of my colleagues looked at them a few years ago. At the time, there were 200 books. He said they all basically say the same thing, right? But it is about intentional. It is about starting out. Everybody says this from John Cotter on, right? Says you have to have a compelling reason for doing this. And you have to be able to persuade people that it's compelling. And I haven't seen companies do that, frankly, very successfully, sort of at all. They just say vague things about we work better when we're together. Well, have you got evidence for that? Have you got things you can tell people about why we're in trouble when we don't do that? Can you persuade people why this is important? Because if you can't, they make up their own story, and the story they're making up, they just don't trust us, right? That's the story that employees are all saying. And, you need to confront that and say, no, it's not that, but look what we're seeing in productivity, or look what we're seeing in innovation, or look what we're seeing in onboarding people or getting them up to speed, whatever it is, make that case as a place to start, right? So, they've all got about 8 steps in organizational change, where to spend your time and all that stuff. But it's a change management exercise, right? And I don't think they're quite paying attention to that. They sort of think it's like, well, we just return to the office. And they're not aware that for a lot of people, they've never been in the office, right? So it's not about return to the office, it's come for the first time, right? So they got to think about this as a bigger project than they're doing.
And maybe also the first thing I would say is that they should drop the word mandate because, you have to avoid framing it as a command and a control situation. I think, we need to reframe that into more, it should be talked about that for reconnection, for collaboration, co-location, for impact. There's so many ways to frame it. A mandate should not be perhaps one of them. Also in the book, we do actually mentioned something that we call the bond framework, which is like 4 different steps, which are based on organizational change principles anyway. So like build the case. Why do employees have to come back to the office? Shifting the narrative again to more about enhancing career growth and through workplace connections, rather than just come back in because I want to. And then always own the expectation. So setting clear and reasonable kind of guidelines for what to expect in the office, normalize the engagement. So really by making the office attendance more purposeful, and then demonstrate inclusion, and psychological kind of safety by ensuring that the return to office does not feel like a rigid one size fits all kind of approach.
Okay, so even when they call it a mandate, which I agree with you, because that sounds so unappealing, what happens when people get back into the workplace? What is the evidence showing about the experience of people? I have seen something where people were dreading it, and then they're like, "Oh yeah, this is not so bad."
I think as Ranya's saying, the initial think about this as organizational change. Think about bringing people back and making it a little more celebratory. I think you're right. You do hear people discover that they are reconnecting with people and they're meeting people. Yes, a huge social isolation problem we've got, which is exacerbated by remote work, right? So I think, trying to make it purposeful is important, and trying to highlight the benefits of it when you first bring people back is really important. I think for sure you have to have some tolerance for the difficulty people have rearranging their lives. They built after 5 years their lives around hybrid or remote, and you're dropping this, boom, we got to fix it now. And I think, greater use of pay time off, the ability for people to take time off or maybe work remotely when they're sick, or, it saves companies money if you can do that stuff, to give people more flexibility makes sense. But especially now, back to the mandate doesn't mean that you don't hold people accountable if they don't show up. But it does mean that's not the argument you're using. You're not doing this because I said so, right? You're doing this because it makes sense for the organization and your fellow employees to be back together. You got to make the case, right?
And of course, it helps if the executives are modeling this behavior. So you can't ask employees to do that and then have senior management do what they want and not follow these rules. So it has to be modeled right from the top.
Yeah, I've heard those stories of, this company that goes through a painful uh, process of bringing people back to the office, and then they hire some key senior position so far away they must work remote. And I mean, what message is that sending?
Yeah, clear. People get it.
We're getting to the end of this. Looking ahead, if companies persist with hybrid and remote work and don't do, the mandate, uh, what long-term organizational risks should they be looking for and managing around?
So Mark Zuckerberg said something interesting about this when they first sent employees home after the pandemic. And he thought things, were going better than they thought. But he said, I think we're running down our stock of resources or something like that. And I think one of the things that saw is that right now companies, organizations are working because longer tenured people still know each other, still know how things work. 5 years in lots of companies, you got a third or half the employees are new. At some point, pretty soon, you start running out of people who know each other. And then you can start to see bigger problems, right? So the fact that you didn't see anything in the first year of remote is not surprising, right? 5 years in, the companies are complaining now about stuff. 10 years in, will you see more of that? I think for sure. I mean, if you think innovation matters, if you think conversations matter, if you think discussion matters, I mean, law firms have done a pretty sharp change in this because they've realized they've got a kind of apprenticeship model, and they see people who were lost as associates are now lost 6 years in longer. So you're going to see bigger problems later out simply because of demographics.
And I think, well, this will also affect things like organizational culture and identity. It will weaken as well in time. People don't feel emotionally, connected to their employers. So the culture will really become kind of fragmented in a way.
Yeah.
Also, the talent development might stall, especially for early career professionals who never got maybe the the start that they needed, the proper onboarding. So this might also affect their careers later. And things like performance management may degrade as well because managers just aren't equipped, to deal with these kind of distributed teams.
Okay. Um, we're running out of time here. We're at time, really. Can you tell us where to find you and where to find your book? Ranya, I'll start with you.
Good, because she knows.
Well, the book book will be released on September the 30th, and it's already available now for pre-order on the Pen Press website and on Amazon. So, and then you can find both Peter and I on LinkedIn, and our respective website pages.
Right. Anything to add, Peter?
2 P's in Cappelli, 2 L's in Cappelli. I mean,
I remember last time editing the video, and I had to check so many times about the spelling of your last name. Anyways, let me close. Well, thanks, Peter and Ranya. I really appreciate the full and even look at the topic. And I'm glad that some of the other interviews I've done are that highlighted intentionality in how we manage remote and hybrid work, that they weren't wrong. However, we have reached the end of this episode. Thanks for listening out there, and we'll catch you next time when I talk with another amazing guest.